Matt from Wasco Nursery here for another episode of Coffee with Matt. We have a live studio audience today, which is fun for me. It's been a couple years since we've had people here for our classes. Of course, the garden center's been open all throughout the pandemic and everything, which has been wonderful, but we put a pause on in-person classes. We do have a little classroom here. It's indoors, so we decided to close that for the time being, but we have a handful of people here with us this morning, which is fun. And we're going to talk all things pruning today. We're going to talk about pruning perennials. We're going to talk about pruning shrubs. We're going to jump into pruning trees and a few other things too. So we've got a lot to talk about. Whenever we talk about pruning, I always like to mention the what, why, when, where, and how of pruning. It's really important that we cover all of those, because if you leave one of them out, the story just isn't quite right. So what are you pruning? It's really important that you know what type of plant you're pruning, because plants have various requirements. Some are going to set their flower buds early in the spring, and if you prune them in the springtime, you might cut off their flowers. Some of them set flower buds in the fall, so that's going to be an issue. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. The when, of course, timing is very critical with certain plants, not all. The where, not where in your yard, that type of thing, but where on the plant do you actually prune. Why is really important. We're going to talk a little bit about that. And then, of course, we'll get into the how, teach you some techniques and things to help you have success in the yard. So we'll jump right in there. The first W is what am I pruning? There's a variety of methods that you can use to determine what type of plant you're pruning. There are some great smartphone apps that are out there. They've come a long way in the last couple of years. You just take a picture of the plant, get fairly close, hold it up to a leaf or two, and it's going to tell you what type of plant it is. Those have become very accurate. They are not going to be able to tell you what cultivar a plant is. So for instance, if you've got a paniculata hydrangea in your yard, it's not going to be able to tell you that it's limelight or a little quick fire or something like that, but it will tell you that it's a paniculata hydrangea, and it'll differentiate a paniculata hydrangea from a smooth hydrangea or one of the other hydrangea plants. So really accurate there. That's a great method. You can always bring plant material into us. We have a great team here that can identify plant material. It's very rare that a day goes by that someone doesn't come in with a snipping off of a plant. Sometimes it's an insect infestation, sometimes it's just IDing a plant, but we're always happy to do that. You can also bring plant material typically. I don't know if they're still doing it with the pandemic, if their office is fully open, but the University of Illinois Extension Office, which is by the Kane County Fairgrounds, they also have a little group there that will help identify plant material. So those are some good ways. You can always email or text photos over to us as well. We're always happy to try and help educate you or identify plants as best we can. So that's a good way of determining what type of plant it is. And the what is very important, because we don't want to say prune lilacs in the fall. So here we are where it's after Labor Day. Lilacs have already set their flower buds. So if I don't know a lilac from a viburnum and I go out into my yard and I start pruning my lilac, the plant is going to be fine, but I have now trimmed off all of its flower buds. And the only point of having a lilac, of course, is having big, beautiful flowers in the springtime that are fragrant, and you can cut them and bring them in the house. But if you trim off all those flowers, a lilac is just a very basic green shrub. So we don't want to prune those in the fall. So we need to know what a lilac looks like. Fragrant viburnum, I actually brought one up. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But a fragrant viburnum has already set its flower buds. In fact, maybe we'll snip off one here. So right out at the tip of this branch is a big round bud. This is the flower bud for next year. So I have effectively snipped that flower bud off of that branch, so that branch isn't going to bloom. Now the branch is still going to grow next year. There's leaf buds, right? You could look at this year's current leaf, and right behind it is next year's leaf bud. And so the plant is all set to go for next year. In fact, most plants are at this point. Most plants can lose their leaves at this time of year and still be perfectly fine. In fact, we're seeing a lot of that as a result of drought stress from this spring and now summer, late summer. We're seeing plants drop their leaves. If that's the case, I wouldn't be super concerned about it. I just looked at a Katsura tree yesterday that had lost all of its leaves as a result of drought stress. Every branch was fully budded for next year. The tree is going to be perfectly fine. It doesn't look great. It was startling to the client whose home that I was at. But the good news is that their 15-year-old or thereabout Katsura tree is going to be fine. But back to the viburnum, if we trim this off, we have no flowers next year. So we need to be able to identify what type of plant it is. And then we jump over to the why. It's actually, it seems like, I don't know, common sense. I certainly don't want to put anybody down, but it's one of the first questions that I ask people when they ask me how to prune, fill in the blank. How do I prune my lilacs, or how do I prune my boxwood? And I'll typically ask them, why do you want to prune them? And sometimes I get a really direct answer. Well, they're too tall, they're hiding the window. That's a great answer. But sometimes I just get a blank look. They're like, well, I don't know, I thought I should just prune it. And just, pruning for the sake of pruning, nobody's out in the wild pruning the trees and the shrubs and things in their native habitat, so they don't have to be pruned. Certainly sometimes there's some very good reasons. If it's blocking your window, that's a great reason. If you have a boxwood hedge, like this one, this is a boxwood shrub right here that I brought. If you have a boxwood hedge that you want to be very formal and squared off, then maintaining that shape is a really good reason to prune that. Sometimes it's just about privacy in terms of keeping a plant full. Sometimes we'll get things like lilacs, privet hedges, things that will end up with foliage up at the top and then nothing down at the bottom. And now my privacy is gone and I can see through the plant or underneath the plant, and I want to try to get that privacy back, put the plant its intended purpose, restore that. So that's a good reason. Sometimes it's just a health reason for the plant. Sometimes we talk about thinning out trees for the health of the tree or for the health of the plant material underneath the tree. So those are some good reasons why we would want to prune. And then of course sometimes it's just removing dead wood, or maybe there's a dangerous limb, something that is hanging over the house that might need to be pruned, those types of things. So there's a lot of reasons why we would want to prune, but there's also sometimes where it's just better to leave the plant alone and let it do its thing. So that's the why. The when, I mentioned that a little bit in terms of timing. It is really important that we first identify what and then figure out the timing. So I mentioned a few things that we wouldn't want to be pruning at this time of year, like our lilac and our fragrant viburnums. But there's other things that we wouldn't want to be pruning, say oak trees. So oaks are a staple of our local ecosystem and a really beneficial tree. And we've got a lot of big, beautiful ones around here. And if you've ever been around me much, you hear me talk about the environmental benefits of oak. So I'm constantly recommending planting oak trees around here. There are more insect species that use, or not just insects, but species in general that use oaks as part of their life cycle. So whether they feed on the acorns or insects that lay eggs on the bark and then hatch, butterflies, moths, all sorts of other insects, there's more that use oaks as part of their life cycle than any other plant in our ecosystem here. So, but that being said, pruning oak trees during the growing season is a big no-no. We have a disease here in our area. It's called oak wilt. And oak wilt is a devastating disease, and one of the ways that oak wilt can be transferred is by pruning during the growing season. You leave open wounds on the tree that can attract insect and disease there. So we would only recommend pruning oak trees, unless it's if you have a large limb that broke in one of these recent windstorms and it's cracked and hanging off and dangerous, of course, by all means, you'd want to get in there and prune that. But if this is pruning to raise the canopy up, if it's pruning for looks or shape or health, any of those kind of things, we would always recommend that you wait until the dormant season. So that's going to be basically after Thanksgiving and typically before Easter. So that time frame is going to be the best time of year to prune oak trees. Another tree that it's really important to know about in terms of timing would be maple trees. So of course everybody's familiar with maple syrup, which obviously comes from the sap of maple trees, and maple syrup or the sap is going to be collected or harvested in the springtime. And so you've all probably seen that before, a bucket hanging on a tree. You know, you've got a little metal tap in there. Well, that's kind of a controlled situation. But if we do a lot of pruning in a maple tree at that time of year in the early springtime, that tree is just going to bleed. It just doesn't stop. And so in the case of collecting maple syrup, you know, based on the size of the tree, the harvester knows how many taps they could put in that type of tree and how much they could collect. But if you got into a maple tree and pruned all sorts of branches, it's just going to be weeping and bleeding all of this healthy sap. That sap is full of sugar, obviously. That's what makes the maple syrup, right? But that sugar is also, in terms of the tree, that's all of its stored energy. And so it's literally just wasting all of these resources. It's just dripping down the tree, and it's going to be wasted. That could be really hard on the tree. If you have a year like this, where we've had a drought, if you did some improper pruning back in March or April, and the tree wasted all of these resources, and then this summer, when it really needed those energy reserves, if you will, because we've had a drought situation, well, now you've kind of created a tough situation on that tree, and you're going to see a lot more stress in it. So that's one of those reasons. So the when is really important. As a general rule, I'm not going to go through every plant. Obviously, we'd be here all day if we talked about when the best time to prune each individual plant is. But as a general rule, if your plant blooms before Mother's Day, you probably don't want to be pruning it right now. Most likely, again, this is not completely comprehensive. I'm trying to give you the best tips I can in a short video format here. But if it's going to bloom before Mother's Day, it's probably already set its flower buds for next year. So if you want to prune for shape, take off the top a little bit, that type of thing, you're probably fine. If you're going to prune a limb here or there or a branch that's, if you've got a plant with a weird wild hair, I like to call it, just kind of sticking out to the side, and you want to trim that off, it's not going to harm the plant any. But if you're going to do an overall pruning, if you have a fragrant viburnum and you do an overall pruning on it, the plant will be fine. It'll be perfectly fine, but you won't have any flowers or very, very few flowers next year. So if you have an early spring blooming plant, the best time to prune is going to be right after it blooms. So when the blooms are done, that's going to be the best time to do some pruning. So if you have a magnolia, a forsythia, lilac, etc., all of those, right after they're done blooming is a great time to prune. That being said, if you have a lilac that is 20 or 30 years old, or maybe you just moved into a home and everything is really overgrown and you need to do some massive pruning on the plant, we would recommend doing that during the dormant season. So at the end of this season, if you have a big lilac or something that you're going to take down 20, 30, 50%, I don't know, we would do that during the dormant season. We would forgo the flowering for that next year, but that's going to be the best time to take that much or that large of a percentage off of a plant. So we wouldn't want to be doing that during the growing season, like I had just mentioned, right after the bloom time. That would not be a good time of year to take a plant like that all the way down. So that's a little bit about timing. Maples can be pruned during the summer or during the fall. Oaks, we mentioned, are going to be in the middle of winter, ideally. For most plant material, the middle of winter is great. As I mentioned, with oaks, we can spread or cause some disease issues. There are very few disease problems that can occur during the winter time. When the plants are dormant and the temperatures are very low, bacteria, fungal spores, all of those kind of things are not present. And then insects and birds and animals, which can sometimes transfer diseases, are not really present on the tree either. And so wintertime is great. We do a lot of our pruning in the nursery during the wintertime. When the trees are dormant, we can see the shape and structure of the tree. We know we're not spreading disease. Of course, from a time standpoint, we have a little bit more time on our hands at that time of year. So that's when our team does a lot of the pruning and structural shaping of trees in the nursery. So winter is really good for most things in terms of the actual health of the plant. So we've talked about the when. In terms of where, I'm going to show you on a handful of plants here where we would want to prune, and then we're going to talk about some pruning methods, and we'll talk a little bit about pruning on this tree behind me here. I have an American Century Linden that I'm standing in front of or underneath, and we're going to do a little bit of pruning on that tree as well. So in terms of wear on the plant, there's a few different things that I want to talk about. The first is like what I like to call directional pruning. Let's see what the best plant to show. Well, we'll talk. I guess we can talk about that on this boxwood here. But one of the things that's kind of interesting on plants, like I mentioned before on that viburnum, I pulled off the leaves, and you can see the buds right behind where the leaf was. And so if you snip right above one of those buds, if it's an alternate leafed plant, you're going to have buds that are separated by a gap or distance of some kind. If it's an opposite plant, the buds are going to be just opposite each other. But whatever direction those buds are facing, that's where that branch is going to grow next season. So if you're pruning a small tree, maybe a Japanese maple or a dwarf ginkgo or a little hydrangea tree or something that you have around your deck or patio or front walk, you can actually look at where those buds are facing and try to determine which way. If you want to prune a branch and you don't want it growing back towards the house, you know, you may want to remove that bud that's facing towards the house and take one that's facing away or out. So you literally can just look at that during the winter time, but you can find it right now, get in there, and you can prune just right after that bud. That's usually a good place on a plant. If you're hand pruning, you would want to prune right after a set of leaf buds. What you don't want to do, let's see if I can give you an example here. Okay, so this viburnum is not going to have much left of it when I'm all done with it here today, but this viburnum branch right here, you can see we've got some gaps between the branches and the buds and whatnot. But what I wouldn't want to do is trim this, and here's the buds for next year, and I've left, on this case, you know, it's about an inch and a half maybe, but I've left this little stub. That stub is not going to do anything there. So when I'm pruning something like that, I would want to go just right after the buds. You know, generally a nice little angled cut right above the buds would be ideal. That angled cut isn't really important on most shrubs. On some things, if you had a flat stub end, sometimes water and things can sit on there. But a little angled cut is great. But again, just right after the bud, so that you're not leaving a section of wood that has no foliage, which is then just going to die and decay. So if we get that trimmed off there, the branch is going to heal and the new buds are going to form from there. And again, if we're looking at like directional pruning, we can even pick off some of those buds or trim off a section that we don't want to be there. So that's just a little bit about directional pruning. In terms of shaping, you know, we mentioned a little bit about boxwood. You know, many people use boxwood as a hedge. If you want something very formal, boxwood is a great formal hedge, but it can also make a nice natural or informal hedge. So it just depends upon what your preference is. So boxwood is one plant that can be trimmed or sheared very heavy. So if you want a very sheared look, you can go in there with hedge clippers or you know, hedge shears of some kind, and you can really shape it just about any way you want. I've seen them square, I've seen them round. Sometimes you see them spiral or shaped like an animal. I mean, you can do just about anything with them. If you want it more natural, but just want it to be, you know, fairly full and consistent, you know, you can go in here and just do a light pruning on the plant just to kind of even it out a little bit and get rid of some of those wild hairs, and just do a little bit of minor shaping just to keep the plant kind of overall full, you know, and then trimming some of these branches over here is going to fill out. There's just a little bit of a gap right down here where my hand is. And so trimming these back a little bit will cause this to fill out a little bit faster, because what I've done by trimming these surrounding branches is I've taken off the terminal bud. And the terminal bud is a little bud that's out at the end of the branch, and that's it's basically, its job is branch elongation. So if I trim off, like in the case of this little branch right here, the terminal bud is out here at the end, and so when I trim that off, the terminal bud is gone, and now all of these little side buds are going to produce more growth than the tip because there's no bud right there. And so I've left the terminal bud on this, in this hole, in this section. So this happens a lot. Sometimes we get some winter damage. Sometimes it's human damage. You know, somebody, you know, fell into the plant or hit the plant. Sometimes it's, you know, mechanical damage of some kind. We got it too close with you know, with the hedge clippers or something, and we made a mistake. And so you end up with a hole in the plant. And so by trimming some of those surrounding branches and leaving that area to grow with its terminal buds, it'll fill out really nicely. That's also great. You know, a couple years ago we had some pretty hefty winter damage on a lot of evergreens really, but boxwood in particular. And one of the things that happened is some branches broke and caused a little bit of an infection called Volatella, and so you ended up with this brown splotch in your boxwood. And so you had to reach down in there and prune that branch out. So that method that I was just talking about is really effective. If every season you just snip out those terminal buds around it, that'll cause and help that, that hole to fill in. So if we wanted to make this a very formal plant, then you know, we could just go straight across the top, straight down the sides, and make this a much more formal shrub. I've left it a little bit more informal here. We'll get into a few specifics in terms of pruning. I wanted to mention evergreens a little bit. Obviously the boxwood that I was just showing is an evergreen, but I brought this little dwarf mugo pine over here just to show you what are called candles. So in terms of pines, pines only produce growth one time a year in the springtime. So this is next year's spring growth, and these candles have already started to form, and now they're going to basically stop. And then in the springtime, these candles are going to stretch. And this waxy coating that's on here is going to basically fall off, and little needles are going to be exposed, and that's going to be next year's growth. So if you want to trim a pine, the only time of year that you can really trim a pine is when those candles have stretched out. So this is a dwarf mugo pine, so it's going to have very small candles. If this was an Austrian pine or a white pine or a larger growing tree, these candles might be 10 or 12 or even 20 inches long in the case of a white pine. So that's going to be the best time of year, and really the only time of year that you'd want to be pruning pines in terms of shaping. Again, if it's a matter of pruning off a limb or something like that, you could do that just about any time of year. Middle of winter would be great. But theoretically, if this was springtime and this candle right here had stretched out and was a couple inches long, and I wanted to keep control of the plant in terms of its size, I can trim off all or a portion of the candle. So if I had 4 inches of new growth, but I don't want the plant growing 4 inches per year, which of course means it's going to grow a foot every 3 years, then I would want to trim some of that off. So I can take that entire candle off and go right near the base. I could trim the candle in half and therefore have only about 2 inches of new growth, or I can just do a few here and there to control the shape of the plant, like I mentioned before on the boxwood, allowing some areas to grow faster than others to even out, say, a lopsided plant or something like that. So in terms of pines, that's basically all there is to it, and the only time of year that you'd want to prune would be in the springtime, again with the exception of removing limbs, which you could do any time of the year. Spruce and Douglas fir and things like that have a different growth setup than pines do. They can basically be pruned any time of the year. They can be sheared. They have much smaller buds. They don't stretch out quite like the pines do. So they can be sheared a little more. I don't really recommend shearing spruce or firs or things like that, but maybe if it's a smaller, you know, dwarf variety, something a little lower growing, or an ornamental variety that you have near the house, maybe you'd want to do a little shearing on it. So you can do that on those varieties. Of course, I mentioned you can shear boxwood and that type of thing. Hemlocks can be sheared, arborvitae can be sheared, though all of those can be pruned any time of the year. But I do get a lot of questions about pruning evergreens, so I wanted to specifically mention those. Junipers, whether they're the low spreading varieties or the more upright varieties, those can pretty much be pruned any time of the year as well. So again, hedge clippers is fine, pruning with shears is fine. If you're unfamiliar with the terms that I'm using, I mean, some of this is fairly common, but this is what we would call a pruning shear. So this is my favorite pruning tool. This is what's called a Felco number 2. It's kind of the industry standard in terms of nursery folk. That's about all we use are the Felco number 2s, but there are varieties of different Felco pruning tools. They're Swiss made, they're you'll have them forever. You can replace parts, you can sharpen blades, you can replace blades. So these are really fantastic. The number 2 is great for me. There are some, there's a left-handed version. There's a one for someone with smaller hands. So there's a lot of options there. So if I talk about pruning shears, that's a pruning shear. Hedge clippers are going to be your long-handled and long-bladed tools. I didn't bring one of those up here because I rarely use them, but you know, people do like to use those, especially for hedging, like boxwood, things like that. I brought up a pruning saw. This is actually a folding saw right here called a Felco 600. They are remarkably sharp and can take off a very large limb in a short amount of time. And we'll talk about this a little bit more in a couple of minutes. I did not bring up what's called a lopper. A lopper is basically has the same head as a pruning shear, but has much longer handles and typically a slightly larger blade. A pruning shear like this is capable of cutting through about 3/4 to 1 inch diameter branches. So it's great for shrubs. It's great for pruning a little bit here and there on a tree. Maybe if there was a limb that was hanging down or something, these are great for that. If you're going to be getting into like 1 to 1.5 inches, 1 3/4, something like that, the loppers, which have much more leverage, are going to be a lot easier for you, and therefore they're going to do less damage to the plant when you cut through the wood. And then, of course, the pruning saw is going to be for anything that's like 1 3/4 or larger. You'd want to be using a pruning saw in order to trim that limb off the plant. So just wanted to talk a little bit about that. And let's talk roses for a minute, because that's one of the other ones that I get a lot of questions about. So I brought up this, this is actually a climbing rose right here, just because it had the longest branches, so I thought it would be easy to talk a little bit about. So pruning roses. I prefer to prune roses right before they wake up in the springtime. So you'll hear some different things about this, and some people in other parts of the country will tell you differently. We have, obviously, here in northern Illinois, a very, very cold winter is typical here. If you trim down roses in the fall or during the winter time, you've left the end of the branch open, and you can see some old limbs in here that were pruned off, and the bark is missing, you know, because you've pruned right through the middle of it. So you've kind of exposed sort of the heartwood of the plant, if you will. But just like on us, our skin is our first layer of protection for, you know, sun and dehydration and all of that kind of thing. The same is true of plants. And so in the case of the roses, this outer bark here is sealing moisture inside the stem of the plant. And so when I cut those tips off, I've allowed moisture to escape, and therefore the limbs to dry out, or what we would call desiccate, over the winter. So I don't like to do a lot of pruning on roses in the fall. I like to leave them up as much as possible. And then early in the spring, late March, early April, sometime around there, I like to get in and start to do my pruning. So that's kind of the timing of it. In terms of what or where, the first thing you're going to want to do is prune out any desiccated wood. And so I don't know how well we can see this here, but on this particular branch, we've got some nice healthy branches. Again, I mentioned earlier that some plants are already starting to lose some leaves, but they're going to be fine. So in the case of this, I've got 1, 2, 3 nice little healthy stems with perfectly set buds for next year. Even though there's no leaves on this branch, it is not dead. It's very, very healthy. But there is a little section right here that is dried out or desiccated, and there's another little branch right here. So again, if this was springtime, I would be getting in here and I'd be looking for these dried out or desiccated branches, and I would get in there and prune out as much of that dried, desiccated wood as I can. Just kind of getting in there. That's going to be job number 1. Prune out dead wood, desiccated wood, etc. The next thing that I'm going to do is maybe just look at the overall size of the plant. So keep in mind that roses are warm weather plants. They love to shoot when it's warm out. And so this year, because it's been we've had both a very warm summer and we've had a very dry summer. So by all accounts, it has been an amazing year for roses. Our roses at home looked awful last year, mostly because of some insect issues. I think I sprayed them once this year, but they are like, they're double knockout roses. They're probably 3.5 to 4 feet tall. They've been blooming really, really well this late summer because it's been hot and dry and they love it. But if we have a mild winter and I start next season with a 3.5 or 4 foot tall rose, by the time I get 2 feet of new growth next year, those are going to be 5.5, 6 feet tall. And that's going to be too tall for the location. I don't think that'll happen, but I have seen knockout roses at 6 feet tall. It is not that uncommon, actually. Maybe not so much around here because we do tend to have some tough winters that kind of knock the plant back a few levels and then it has to start back over. But if we did have a mild winter and we've got all of that growth from last year, or in the case this year, we're going to have a huge plant. So I'm going to want to take that plant back. So that would be the first thing to do, is look at the size and then determine how much I want to trim the plant back. So theoretically, if this was a big, long, sturdy stem on my knockout rose instead of this climbing rose, I may want to take off half of the plant. If that's the case, I'm going to take off, I've got this stem, it's about 30 inches long. I'm going to go back about 15 inches. I'm going to look for a really nice, healthy bud, and then I'm going to trim, like I mentioned before, at a slight angle just above that bud, and this is what I'm going to be left with. And then it's going to start growing from this bud here in the spring rather than these buds way out here. So that's how I'm going to control the growth and size of this plant. If it was a tough winter and you had 4 foot long stems from the previous growing season, don't be surprised on a rose in particular if the upper half or 2/3 of the stem is all black and discolored. So that's the winter damage, which is very typical on roses around here, and that is what we would want to prune out. So we would travel back to where we see nice healthy green wood with nice healthy green buds. In the springtime, oftentimes you'll see the buds are pushing out bright red new growth. That's really common because the chloroplasts, which that's what makes the leaf green, chlorophyll makes it green, the chloroplasts make chlorophyll, and they haven't started yet. It's still too early for them, it's too cold, and so that's why they have that nice red color. And then as soon as the chloroplasts kick in, then the leaves start to turn green. The opposite happens in the fall. Chloroplasts start to shut down earlier than some of the other plasts, which produce red pigmentation or orange pigmentation, and that's why we get fall color in sugar maples and things like that. So that has nothing to do with pruning, but so that's kind of rose pruning 101. Just a couple other things which also aren't pruning related in terms of rose care. I always like to put a nice layer of mulch over the crown of the plant. So you can't really see it because it's down in the pot, but the crown is this area right here where the stems meet the soil. That was what we would call the crown, and we want to make sure we have a nice 2 to 4 inch layer of mulch over the root system and right around the crown of the plant for winter time. That's a great winter protection. And then when we're doing our early spring pruning in late March or early April, we'd want to thin that mulch out and pull it away from the stems of the plant. I like to do the same thing for macrophylla hydrangea. So those are the hydrangeas with the big pink and blue flowers that have become so popular. We used to not grow them at all around here because they aren't well suited to northern Illinois weather and winters. However, breeders have developed some remontant varieties, which are reblooming varieties that can bloom on both old wood and new wood. So now we have the opportunity to grow some of those around here, but they still need a little extra winter care and protection. So a nice heavy mulch layer around the base of them. I basically do all of the same things. I treat my roses just like my macrophylla hydrangeas, or I treat them the same. So extra winter protection down around the base of the plant. I don't do any pruning on them until, in the case of the hydrangeas, they're not going to start pushing any new growth until late April or sometime in early May. So rather than March, April on the roses, they always wake up earlier. The hydrangeas wake up a little bit later, so I probably am not doing any pruning on those macrophylla hydrangeas until early May. and I'm doing the same thing. I'm checking the stem, I'm finding out which buds are healthy and which ones are not, and I'm trimming just above the first set of healthy buds in the case of the hydrangea, and I'm thinning out any mulch that I added on there. Over the root system, 2 inches is great, but I don't want anything up around the crown of the plant during the growing season. I can have all sorts of disease and insect issues if I leave that there. On both roses and macrophylla hydrangeas, another good thing is to put a chicken wire cage around it and fill it with just fallen leaves, whatever leaves have fallen in your yard. You can fill that cage with leaves. That's a kind of a nice insulation blanket. That'll prevent some of that desiccation from happening. Of course, just like us, you know, if we wear a coat in the wintertime and that drying winter wind is not hitting our skin, we're going to be a lot warmer and better off than if we just went out in a t-shirt in the middle of winter. And so that's kind of what happens when we put that layer of leaves and foliage and other things around a more sensitive plant like a rose or a macrophylla hydrangea. All right, this is kind of, it's definitely pruning related, but another question that I get asked fairly often, sometimes it's larger, you know, not big mature trees, but maybe it's a 5 or 6 foot tall tree, maybe it's a fruit tree, maybe it's something that, an evergreen that got damaged in a storm, like a snow or ice storm. Sometimes we need to establish a new leader in a plant. So it is pruning related, but it's a very specific situation, but I do get a lot of questions about it. And so I found this little oak tree here in the sales yard that has developed competing leaders. So what actually happened on this plant, and I don't know the plant's history, although it is one that we grew here, but right in the center, this is, in the case of a tree, we would actually call that a V crotch. Right at the bottom of the crotch, there's the original leader of the plant is right there, and it died for some reason. I don't know if it broke, I don't know if it just died out, but there's a little stub there, and so the 2 buds on either side of it have been competing for the last, what looks like maybe 3 years, and they haven't figured out who's the more dominant one. So I've got these 2, I'll take out the bamboo that I brought. So I've got these 2 leaders that are kind of co-dominant right now. And so what I want to do is I want to select one of those to be the leader of this tree, and which is going to develop into the stem and trunk of the tree over time. In this particular case, it's actually pretty obvious to me. I don't know how well you can see all of this, but the one on my right, and the co-dominant leader over here, we're going to trim, or is actually doing a pretty good job on its own of being upright, is I like to try to work either a bamboo or a metal pole of some kind of as close to the tree as I can so that I can tie that leader. Sometimes they're more forked like this, and so the leader should be in the middle, and I've got these 2, you know, almost like goalposts, and I need to bring one of those over. And so this bamboo stake or metal stake is going. And so what I like to do is look at the co-dominant leader and find on the tree this, and so in the case of one, I think I'll probably just snip this back to about right there. We'll see what happens down the road, but we'll allow this to branch out. My guess is that most of this is going to get pruned off in time anyway, but for now we're going to leave that because it's going to produce a lot of resources for the tree. And then we're going to call this one the leader, and for these purposes, let's say this was growing way off to the side like this. What we would want to do is bring it back into the middle. So we've pruned off the one, we've brought it back into the middle, and then I like to use this green vinyl stretch tie. It's not sticky at all. There's no adhesive on here. So you could use all sorts of stuff. Masking tape actually works fairly well because it'll kind of degrade or decompose or whatever on its own. What you don't want to do is use something, I mean, this vinyl stretch tie will not decompose, so it is going to have to be removed, but it's really important that you do remove it at some point, otherwise it's going to start to cut into the tree. But what I like to do then is bring that leader back over to my pole, and then I will just simply, in the case of the vinyl stretch tie, I just tie it. You can use a little stapler, you can do all sorts of stuff, but I like to just get in there and tie that and attach it to my bamboo stake, and I'll do that in 2 or 3 different places. Now, if this was a larger tree, so we'll just kind of redo this just a little bit here. I'm going to take my vinyl stretch tie off. So let's say that this was up inside a tree. Maybe it's a 6 or 8 or 10 foot tall tree, and the leader was damaged or destroyed, or maybe you have an arborvitae that had 2 leaders, or you have an arborvitae that the main leader broke out of the tree for some reason, and you need to take a side branch and reestablish that as a leader. You can do the same method, but what you'll do is you'll basically use the bamboo or your pole, whatever it is, a fiberglass pole or anything, you're going to use that as a splint. So if for instance, let's say this top leader up here was damaged for some reason, and I need to make this the new leader, what I do is I'll take the pole and I'll attach it to the trunk of the tree in multiple spots here, and then have it stick up extra high, and then I can take this side branch, which I'm going to form into the new leader, and then I can bring that over and I can attach it to what's remaining of the pole, what's sticking up. So I'll attach it up here, and I'll attach it right down here, and I've already attached it maybe in 3 places against the trunk of the tree. So I've basically created a splint, and then I'll give this a season or 2 to grow, and this will become the new leader, and we'll do some pruning on some of those side branches later. So that's how you reestablish a new leader in a tree. That can be really helpful for all sorts of plants. I do get a handful of questions about pruning grasses. It's actually super easy, but I did want to mention it. So I actually brought this grass up here that if we look in here, we can see last year's foliage. So the stems from last year are these kind of dried out, straw colored stems. They're very stiff. They're about 4 to 6 inches long. And I would actually say that this was improperly pruned last year. I don't like to leave 4 or 6 inches of growth. And actually you can see what has happened as a result of that. If we look at the plant from the top down, it's more or less created what I call the donut effect. So I've got lots of nice healthy green growth all around the perimeter, and I basically have little to nothing. There's just a few little stems that have come up through the center of last year's growth. So this is why I don't like to do this, and now I'm going to tell you what I do like to do. What I like to do is cut as low to the ground as humanly possible. At home, I've got some larger ornamental grasses. I like to take the whole grass. I grab as much of it as I can like this, and then I will take a bungee cord or a rope or twine, wrap it around here real good like you're putting your hair in a ponytail, get that good and cinched. And then I take my pruning saw, the one that I showed you before. I use this, especially on my bigger grasses, like this particular one is called porcupine grass. Porcupine grass will develop almost bamboo-like canes. I mean, it is incredibly sturdy and dense, and I like to take my pruning saw. Now, there's a little lip in the pot here, but I like to take my pruning saw, I lay it flat on the ground, I've got my grass all cinched up, and I just go back and forth like this. That's about as low as I can get, so that's going to leave basically this little like 1/4 inch or thereabouts, and so I'm just cutting right through there, leaving as much, leaving as little as humanly possible down at the bottom. The reason that that grass that I just showed you a minute ago that kind of had that sort of donut effect, the reason that that happens is that that's the majority of the roots, of course, from last year are right underneath that. And that thick 6 inches of old stems and foliage is basically creating a barrier for water, oxygen, as well as like fertilizer, nutrients from getting down to where the good healthy roots are of that plant. And so what happens is the water and the nutrients end up around, in the case of this potted plant, they end up around the perimeter. It's no different than at your house. So if you left a big cut stump and it's raining and you fertilize or whatever, all of that goes to the perimeter. And so the plant just naturally says, well, there's nothing good happening here in the middle. And as those little roots that are underground, they start to find water and oxygen and nutrients out here. And so then they start to sprout over there. And the roots that are on the inside basically die off. That's not uncommon at all. You know, plants, roots don't live forever. You know, big structural roots on trees live a long time. But the little white hairy roots, what we call feeder roots, those only live for a year or two. And so what's happening is as those roots are saying, hey, we've got nutrients and water out here, then they sprout. And the ones that are in here are like, no, I'm all done. So they stop. And then it creates the donut effect. So you may also at some point have to just divide the plant, you know, because after a while, some of those big grasses, you know, they've just developed such a huge mass in there that it just has to be dug up and divided. Although that's not really pruning, I'll just mention it quick. When you do that, you basically want to dig all the way around the perimeter of the plant. You're going to go down approximately, for most perennials and big grasses, things like that, between 8 and 12 inches. I like to dig the entire plant up and get it out of the ground, and then I'll slice it into quarters or thirds, or depends upon what the plant is and how big it is. And then I'll put one of those back in, and then I'll have 2 or 3 that I could relocate to somewhere else in the yard. That's really all there is to it as far as dividing, whether it be a hosta or a daylily or a big ornamental grass like that porcupine grass that I just showed you. So that's a little bit about that. We haven't really talked much about pruning trees, and that's the one last thing that I wanted to mention, and then we're going to do a little pruning demonstration on this linden here. In terms of pruning trees, of course, I always recommend that you know your own limits. You know, climbing trees, pruning huge limbs, that's not for the average homeowner. It's not for myself either. I don't climb trees. I for sure hire that out. But there's always times when some of the lower limbs on trees need to be removed or pruned. Or if you have a younger tree, that's certainly something you can do yourself. There's no reason to pay someone to do that unless you want to. So in terms of pruning, there's a couple things that we want to know in regards to pruning trees. I always like to use my thumb as a little example. For those of you that are here in the audience, there's a little diagram on here. I think we are going to post the photo of this. But just in terms of the structure of the tree, there's a couple things that we want to know when we're pruning off a limb. If my thumb is the limb, and you all can do this because you all have a thumb, right at the bottom where your knuckle is, there's going to be some little wrinkles right there. And that is called the branch collar. And that branch collar is what is going to heal over the wound when we prune this off. So it's really important that you know what the branch collar is and where to find it or how to find it on the limb, and that you don't damage it, because that's the good healing tissue. Every cell in a plant has a job. A leaf can't become a root, and a root can't become a trunk, all of that kind of thing. And the same is true in terms of the branch out here. So that branch collar, there are cells in there that are designed to grow and heal over. But there are not cells right out here. That's why before, when I mentioned when we prune, we don't want to leave a little stub. And I've seen this in people's yards on trees. I've actually seen quote unquote professionals do this, where they trim a tree and they leave a 6 or 2 or 8 inch stub, and that can't heal. And so what happens is that starts to decay, and that decay works its way all the way back into the trunk, and that's how you can get some big hollow trunks on old trees. So we need to know where the branch collar is. Right up at the top in here where the wrinkles are between your finger and your thumb, that's what's called the branch bark ridge. That does the same thing. So the branch bark ridge and the branch collar, you need to know what those are and where to find those on the limb, and you want to not damage them. So those two things are really important in terms of trimming trees. And then the last thing is to know and understand is what we call the 3-cut method. And we're going to demonstrate that here in just a minute. But in terms of the 3-cut method, the reason that I like this is that it will prevent using this method will prevent damage to the branch bark ridge or the branch collar. One thing that happens very frequently, I see this all the time, again, sometimes professionals, sometimes just, homeowners, but you've got a long branch, there's a lot of weight, more weight than you would expect in that limb. And if I start cutting from the top right here and I cut down, naturally what happens is the weight of that branch wants to pull downward. And when it pulls downward, that bark that's still attached right along here just tears right along with it. And so it'll end up, in the case of like this tree here, if I did that, it would just tear and come all the way down, and it would damage that whole section there. And then that branch collar that I was mentioning has been damaged or removed. And so I end up with a wound that either can't heal or takes 5 times as long, whatever the case may be, to heal over, if it heals at all. So we want to avoid that. The way that we avoid that is the 3-cut method. So if I'm going to take this entire limb off, my first cut is going to be further away from the trunk, and I'm actually going to start at the bottom, and I'm going to saw about 1/3 of the way up. So I take my pruning saw, I'm on the underside of the branch, I'm pruning back and forth, and I'm going to go up about 1/3 of the way through that stem. That cut is the cut that's going to prevent what I just mentioned from happening. So when the weight of that branch wants to fall, it's going to stop. The tearing of the bark is going to stop where I made that initial cut. So that's my first cut. And then my second cut is just right after that, or a little bit closer to the tree trunk, and I'm going to start from the top, and I'm going to start to cut downward. And when I start cutting, when it gets to a point where the weight of the branch can no longer support itself, it's more or less going to crack approximately right between the first and second cut. My third cut, so I've taken that branch off, and then my third cut is going to be a nice clean cut, as close to the branch collar and branch bark ridge as I can get without cutting into them. All right, so my first and second cut are out here away from the trunk. I've removed the limb, I'm left with just a little stub, and my third cut is a nice, clean, soft cut closer to the trunk where the branch can heal over. And so if we want to start to zoom in over here, I want to show you a couple things. So this is an American Century linden. It's a great parkway tree. We use it in parking lot islands. It's wonderful at the corner of the house because it keeps a nice upright profile. It's one of my favorite substitutes or replacements for ornamental pears, which are dying from fire blight and other problems around here. So this is a really wonderful tree. If you look at the tree here, you're going to see 3 strange areas there. They look kind of, kind of like a little donut almost. And what's happened, that's where a limb was pruned off. And these limbs were pruned off very, very appropriately. And this is completely healed over. So the branch bark collar and the branch collar and the branch bark ridge have healed that limb over. I've got new bark here, and I would guess in a matter of maybe 2 more years, you probably won't even know that that was there. So this is healed over really, really nicely. But of course it makes sense that we wouldn't want 3 limbs in a row, and we wouldn't want 3 limbs this low to the ground because I'm not going to be able to walk around the tree, mow around it. If it was a parkway tree or in a parking lot island, it may be infringing on sight lines and visibility. So of course there's good reasons to take those off. Now I'm going to take off this limb right up here because I'm going to keep raising this canopy up just a little bit over time. And so in the case of this tree, like I mentioned, we're going to do a 3-cut. So first, we just to refresh or to review, we look over here. This is the branch collar. Right up in the top here is what's called the branch bark ridge, and this is the branch collar. So we're going to go out here, and again, if I just started cutting, which is very typical, if I just went right here and just started cutting, the weight of this branch is going to pull, and then this bark is going to tear all the way down here, and we really want to avoid that. So I'm going to go out here away from where I want to trim, and I'm just going to start to cut. And so I cut from the bottom. Like I mentioned, this saw is exceptionally sharp. Okay, so I've made my cut about 1/3 of the way up, and that cut is going to prevent this tearing. So now I go just beyond that, right over here. Make it just I'm going to make that first cut just a little deeper. Okay, so then I go right on the outside over here, and I start to cut. And naturally, the weight of that branch is going to start to fall, and you heard it crack, and you can see what's left is just a little bit. So there's my initial cut, there's my second cut, and it cracked right where I said it would. It literally cracked right off, and now we can just lift that right up. Thank you, Megan. And so you can see what I'm left with. Now there's no weight to deal with. I don't have this big, long, heavy branch. So now I can go in here, and again, I want to get as close to the branch bark ridge and the branch collar as I can without cutting into it, so that I hopefully am going to end up with something like this. So I kind of look and do an imaginary little deal here. I'm like, okay, that angle looks pretty good. And so I start right up there, and I just start to cut downward like that. Take my time, and once it starts to get a little bit loose, I still don't want to damage this, so it's not like, I'm not out of the woods, so I hold that, and nice and slow, right through there. I've left just that little tiny bit. This is going to heal over really nicely. I don't have some weird cut stub that looks like a rung on a ladder. We've cleaned that off really nicely, and that's going to be allowed to heal over. This will heal from the top, this will heal from the bottom, and in a couple of years it's just going to be like that, just like you see these others right over here. So that's the 3-cut method. Obviously that wasn't a huge limb, but you can prune, big limbs if you're using a chainsaw. I still use the same thing. Again, know your limits and what you can and can't prune on your own. But if you learn nothing else, you've learned proper tree pruning techniques. Which one? This one right here? All right, sure. Why don't you come around this side here? So we've also got kind of a weird branch growing inside the crotch of the plant right here. And in the case of this right here, all of the principles hold true. This is going to be a much more difficult to remove limb, just because we don't have any really good angles there. So if we wanted to remove something like that, I would do the same thing. So I'm going to start out here and do my 3-cut. So we've removed the limb, and then we would want to get in here. This is the part where it's going to be a little more difficult, but we're going to want to remove as much of this as we can. Might even be a little better to go from that angle. And we leave it like so. This can heal over. It's not going to interfere with the growth of this main limb over here any longer, and this will heal over without having a big stub in there. Or unfortunately, what happens in the case of this branch, if this branch doesn't get pruned or is left to grow and it breaks and cracks, we've created down at the bottom of that crotch, we've created an area for water and soil and grime and everything to collect right in there, and then we cause this area to oftentimes just kind of rot out. So we want to try to avoid that. So those are the kind of things that we like to look at on, this is still a relatively young tree. Even though it's, 25 feet tall and has an 8-inch diameter trunk, for all intents and purposes, it's still a relatively young tree. So we would want to go in there and look for those things and say, hey, here's a few areas of potential problem. In the case of this limb, it wasn't a potential problem. It was just a little bit too low, and I wanted to kind of keep raising the canopy up over time. In the case of this limb right here, this was going to cause some problems potentially for this main limb over here, which I don't want to remove. And so we wanted to take that off now. So there's always other things that can be done. Sometimes it's just a matter of leaving a limb. I'll grab my shears here. Oftentimes it's a matter of leaving a limb because I want that whole limb, but just taking off some of the lower growth that's maybe hanging downward. So I do that a lot at home, where I might want to leave the limb for a couple of years, but just want to thin it out a little bit. Like, those are the types of things that you can easily do on your own, even doing some of the stuff that we talked about. That can be done on your own. And then now we've created a little more space right over here, and maybe aesthetically. Sometimes these branches are weird. I had one tree at home that had a limb very similar to this, And then I just had this branch that almost shot straight down. It just looked weird. It wasn't problematic for any reason, but we just pruned that out so we don't have any issues there. So that's kind of tree pruning 101. We've talked about pruning grasses. We've talked about hydrangeas and shrubs and all sorts of other things. So as I mentioned at the beginning, we're not going to be able to talk about every individual plant. So if there's particular plants that you want to discuss or talk about, feel free to come in with pictures or maybe even a video of the plant. We'd be happy to try to help you in terms of what to do there. If you're looking for a company to come out and do some pruning for you and you're in the U.S., we do an awful lot of work with Davey Tree Care. Davey Tree Care is a national company. So they're all across the U.S. They have local offices and local sales reps, arborists that will come out, talk to you about your property. So we work very closely with them. If there's something that you don't feel comfortable with on your own, maybe reach out to Davey and give them a call. But if you need help with how to prune and it's something that you think you can tackle, feel free to bring that stuff into us. As always, thanks for watching. Really appreciate you spending the morning with me. Have a wonderful day.